The room is 9 feet wide. Abdi Farhan Wasim knows this because he has counted the steps. 3 from the plastic chair to the east wall, 3 from the plastic chair to the door, 3 from the door to the narrow window that looks out onto a concrete courtyard where nothing grows. He has counted them many times. He does not know why he keeps counting. He sits in the chair and he does not move. A nurse enters. She is young, wearing blue scrubs with a bleach stain near the left pocket. She checks his pulse by pressing 2 fingers to his wrist, writes a number on a clipboard, and walks out. The entire visit lasts 11 seconds. Abdi does not turn his head. His eyes stay fixed on the wall in front of him, specifically on a patch near the baseboard where something green has dried into the plaster, a stain that has been there longer than he has. He does not blink at unusual intervals. He is not sedated. He is simply still, in a way that healthy people are never still. He is 33 years old. He was until 5 years ago a secondary school teacher. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The city outside that window is Hargeisa, capital of Somaliland, a self-declared republic in the northern Horn of Africa that the rest of the world has mostly declined to officially recognize. It is a city of crumbling colonial architecture and new concrete buildings going up simultaneously, a place where the call to prayer echoes over the sound of diesel generators and where the market streets fill before dawn with trucks arriving from Ethiopia. Every morning, without exception, those trucks carry the same cargo: bundles of fresh green stems and leaves, wrapped tight in banana leaves, still damp from the highland farms where they were cut in darkness a few hours before. Khat. Thousands of kilograms of it, delivered to a city that will consume every gram before sundown. Khat is a plant. Specifically, it is Khatha edulis, a flowering shrub native to the highlands of Ethiopia and Yemen, cultivated for centuries, chewed for the stimulant chemicals locked inside its fresh leaves. The active compounds are called cathinone and cathine. They act on the brain's dopamine and norepinephrine systems, the same pathways targeted by amphetamines. This is not a fringe comparison made by critics of Khat. It is the pharmacological consensus. Cathinone, the primary active compound, is structurally and functionally similar enough to amphetamine that the United States Drug Enforcement Administration classified it as a Schedule I controlled substance in 1993. In East Africa, it is sold openly on the street, in dedicated shops, at bus terminals, and outside mosques. 20 million people chew it every day across Ethiopia, Somalia, Somaliland, Djibouti, Kenya, and Yemen. 20 million. In Somaliland specifically, a 2021 household survey found that more men between the ages of 18 and 40 chew khat on any given day than hold formal full-time employment. That is not a statistic about a drug problem existing alongside normal life. That is a statistic about a drug problem that has become the texture of normal life, the background hum against which everything else happens, against which marriages break, against which children go unfed, against which men sit in plastic chairs in 9-foot rooms and stare at green stains on walls. The khat trade in Ethiopia alone generates an estimated $250 million a year in export revenue. It is the country's second largest agricultural export. There are farmers in the Harar region of eastern Ethiopia who have grown nothing but khat for 3 generations. Their children have never planted anything else. The plant sustains them, feeds them, pays for school fees and wedding costs and funeral expenses. The same plant sits in Abdi Wasim's bloodstream, or rather, sat there until it didn't anymore. He stopped 2 years ago. The stillness in that room is not intoxication. That is the first thing to understand, and it upends everything that comes after. The cat is gone. What it left behind is not. Cat-induced psychosis is a recognized clinical condition. It presents with symptoms indistinguishable from acute schizophrenia, paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations, profound disorganization of thought and speech. In most cases, when the drug is removed and the patient receives correct treatment, the psychosis resolves partially or fully within weeks or months. In some cases, it does not resolve. In some cases, the dopaminergic damage is sustained, the cognitive architecture does not rebuild itself, and what remains is a man who sits in a plastic chair and counts steps and stares at a wall and cannot explain, if asked, what year it is or what he used to do for work. The clinical literature on this outcome is thin, not because it is rare, because the populations where it occurs most frequently, poor, rural, East African, predominantly Muslim men, are not populations that generate the kind of sustained international research funding that produces thick clinical literature. Abdi Wassim has not been correctly diagnosed. This will matter enormously. It has already shaped every medical decision made about him for the past 2 years. The full weight of what that means will only become clear much later in this story. For now, the room, the chair, the wall. The green stain near the baseboard is approximately the size of a human palm. It is the colour of cat juice that has dried in warm air, a specific dull botanical green that anyone who has spent time around cat sessions would recognise immediately. How it got there is not recorded anywhere. The facility opened in 2019. The stain was already there. Abdi looks at it, or he points his eyes at it. The nurse on her way out does not look at it at all. Here is the question that this story will eventually answer, but not yet, not for a long time. What is Abdi Farhan Wassim actually seeing when he looks at that wall? And the second question, quieter but heavier, how does a man who never once touched Khat for the first 26 years of his life end up here, in 9 feet of concrete, 2 years clean, still gone? Hargeisa in 2016 was a city in the middle of becoming something. New buildings were going up on Ahmed Dagger Street faster than the roads beneath them could be repaired. Satellite dishes sprouted from rooftops that still had holes from the 1988 aerial bombardment, a war that ended before Abdi Farhan Wassim was born but whose physical marks the city had never fully erased. The population had tripled since the 1990s. Somaliland had been peaceful for 2 decades, self-governing, quietly functional in a region where those qualities were not guaranteed. There was an electricity grid that worked most of the time. There were traffic jams. There were 2 universities. Abdi had graduated from one of them. His teaching certificate was issued in June 2016 by the University of Hargeisa's Faculty of Education. He kept it in a plastic sleeve and stored it flat under his mattress, which was not sentimentality, it was practical. The humidity warped paper. He had watched a neighbour's land documents corrugate and split over one rainy season, and he was not going to let that happen to the only official credential he had ever earned. His classroom was at a private secondary school in the Mohammed Haibe district, 15 minutes on foot from his parents' house. 41 students. Abdi taught English and general science, both subjects in the same room, using a single overhead projector that worked when the generator was running and didn't when it wasn't. On days without power, he wrote everything on the board in large, deliberate letters that the students in the back row could read. He had learned, in his first month of teaching, exactly how large those letters needed to be. He had paced to the back himself and checked. The chalk dust settled into the creases of his knuckles. By Friday each week his hands looked 10 years older than the rest of him. He was 25. He was not unhappy. That is a precise and important distinction. Not happy in an uncomplicated way, not coasting, but oriented. He knew where he was going, or believed he did, and in a city where a significant portion of young men had no such belief, that alone was a form of wealth. His family occupied a 2-story concrete house in the Sha'ab neighborhood, a 15-year-old structure that Hassan Wassim had built, room by room as money allowed, which meant the ground floor was solid, and the upper floor had a slight lean to the east that no one in the family acknowledged. Hassan ran a hardware shop 4 streets away. Bolts, wire, piping, hand tools, the kind of inventory that a growing city perpetually needs. He was a compact, deliberate man who spoke carefully and expected his sons to do the same. He had opinions about most things and expressed them without qualification. About Khat he expressed them constantly. Hassan Wassim's position on Khat was not religious argument or abstract morality. It was specific and empirical. He had watched his own brother lose a shop to Khat debt in 1997. He had watched 3 men from his mosque go from occasional users to daily users to men who sat in doorways and stared at nothing, all within 4 years. He named those men when he spoke about it. He used their full names. He wanted his sons to understand that this was not a hypothetical. His younger son Samir was 19 in 2016, studying economics at a university in Addis Ababa on a partial scholarship that covered tuition but not living expenses, which meant Hassan was sending money to Ethiopia every month and feeling it. Samir called home on Sunday evenings. His voice on the phone had the particular energy of someone encountering a larger world and finding it mostly confirm their assumptions. He was going to return to Hargeisa with a degree and do something structural, something that would outlast him. He was 19. He believed this completely. Abdi's salary was 180,000 Somaliland shillings per month. At the 2016 exchange rate, that was approximately $22. He was not the lowest paid teacher at the school. He was the second lowest. The lowest paid was a man named Mahad Guled Ismail, 30 years old, teaching mathematics, who had been at the school for 4 years and had not received a single salary increase in that time. Mahad was thin in the way that people who skip meals regularly become thin, not dramatically, just consistently, as if he were being slowly edited down. He and Abdi ate lunch together on most days. Rice from a place near the school that charged 60 shillings for a plate with a small scoop of goat stew on the side. They talked about the school, about students, about the cost of everything going up while their salaries stayed fixed. Mahad talked about this more than Abdi. There was a specific quality to how Mahad discussed money. Not panic, not despair, but a flat, recursive exhaustion. Like a man who has done the arithmetic so many times, he has stopped being surprised by the answer. Khat was present in Abdi's world the way traffic noise is present. Constant, unremarkable, belonging to the background. The vendor 3 blocks from the school opened before 7 in the morning and was sold out by early afternoon on most days. Men sat outside the shop on low plastic stools, chewing, talking, watching the street. On the walk home, Abdi passed them daily. He knew some of them by face. He did not stop. He had never stopped. His father's warnings had not made Khat frightening to Abdi exactly. They had made it boring, a known danger, categorized and filed, requiring no further consideration. He had peers who chewed occasionally, socially, at weddings and Khat sessions hosted by older relatives. He had attended 2 such sessions in his life, sitting at the edge, drinking tea, leaving early. He had never chewed, not once, not even a leaf. He corrected student papers in the evenings by the light of a 40-watt bulb that his mother kept replacing because Abdi kept burning them out. His handwriting in the margins was small and precise. He used red ink for errors and blue ink for encouragement, a system he had invented for himself and never explained to anyone. Students who received papers back from him sometimes turned them over looking for more annotations, because there were always more annotations than they expected. He ate dinner with his parents every evening. His mother, Fadumo, cooked and did not discuss much except the immediate logistics of the household. What needed to be bought, what needed to be fixed, who had visited. Hassan talked about the shop. Abdi talked about his students. The meal was the same most evenings. Rice, beans, a piece of flatbread, tea afterward. One evening in late 2016, Abdi sat down with a sheet of paper and calculated exactly how long it would take him to save enough money to rent his own apartment, given his current salary and his current expenses. He accounted for everything: food, transport, his contribution to the household, occasional small loans to Samir. He ran the numbers 3 times because the answer seemed wrong. It was not wrong. At his current salary and saving rate, he would be able to afford his own apartment in 4 years and 3 months. That was assuming no emergencies, no salary cuts, no inflation in the rental market, and no unexpected expenses of any kind. He folded the paper and put it in the same drawer as his teaching certificate. He did not touch it again. The number sat in his mind, though. It stayed there through the evening and through the next morning and through the school day. 4 years and 3 months was not an impossibly long time. It was also not a short time. He was 25. It would be the same calculation at 29 if nothing changed. And nothing, as far as he could see, was about to change. Down the street, 4 blocks away, the Khat vendor was pulling down his shutters for the night. The last few customers of the day had peeled off 20 minutes earlier. The vendor swept the leaf scraps from his doorstep, pocketed his earnings in a cloth pouch he kept inside his shirt, and walked home. He had not eaten lunch that day. He would not eat dinner either. He'd been chewing since 6 in the morning. He was not hungry. Abdi walked home from school the next afternoon and passed the vendor's stall. A group of 5 men sat outside on the plastic stools, chewing, talking, unhurried, with the specific ease of people who have nowhere to be. One of them was laughing at something, a sustained, genuine laugh, not performed. Abdi slowed almost imperceptibly, then kept walking. He was behind on grading 43 essay questions. His rent contribution was due Friday. Samir's next tuition installment would need to come from somewhere by the end of the month. He counted his money that night sitting on the edge of his bed. The 40-watt bulb buzzed. The papers were still ungraded on the desk. He put the money back in the drawer, on top of the folded calculation sheet, on top of the plastic sleeve with the teaching certificate inside. He did not think about the men outside the Khat stall. He thought about the essays. He thought about the rent. He thought about nothing unusual, nothing that would distinguish that evening from any other evening in a long, unbroken series of evenings that had been, until that point, quietly, narrowly, entirely his own. The school's funding situation, which Abdi knew was fragile, had just become something worse than fragile. He didn't know that yet. He would know it in 11 weeks. The letter arrived at the school in February 2017. It was not addressed to Abdi specifically. It was a single typed page posted on the staff notice board, held up by one drawing pin through the top centre, hanging slightly crooked. Abdi read it on a Tuesday morning before his first class. The school's primary government subsidy, which had been covering 40% of operating costs, was being reduced by half, effective the following month, as part of a broader reallocation of the Somaliland Ministry of Education's budget toward newly constructed public schools in outlying districts. The headmaster called a staff meeting that afternoon and said what the letter had already said, in the same words, with less affect than the typed page had managed. Abdi's salary was cut to 90,000 shillings the following month, $11. He picked up private tutoring immediately, 3 students, then 5, meeting them in the evenings at their homes or at a small study room he rented by the hour at a copy shop near the market. He was good at it. The parents paid him directly, in cash, and the cash helped. But the arithmetic was still wrong. The tutoring added perhaps 60,000 shillings per month in a good month, which meant he was back near his original salary if everything aligned perfectly and nothing went sideways. Everything went sideways in April. The school's owner, a businessman named Abdurrashid, who ran the school as one of several investments and had never, to anyone's knowledge, set foot inside a classroom, informed the headmaster that salaries would be suspended for 2 months while the school restructured its finances. Not cut, suspended. The word was meant to imply they would return. 2 months passed, then a third. Abdi kept teaching. So did Mahad. So did most of the staff, partly because they had no immediate alternative and partly because the headmaster assured them, weekly, that resolution was imminent. The students kept coming. Parents kept paying school fees, which meant the school was collecting revenue while paying nothing to the people delivering the education. This was not unusual in Somaliland's private school sector. It happened regularly and almost never resulted in legal consequences. By June, Abdi had borrowed money from his father twice. He had not told Hassan what the second loan was for. Hassan had not asked, which was its own kind of answer. Hassan knew, or suspected, and chose the question unasked over the answer confirmed. Mahad stopped eating lunch, not occasionally, entirely. He brought nothing to school, bought nothing at the rice place near the school gate, and when Abdi noticed and said something indirect about it, not confrontational, just an offer, phrased as surplus, Mahad declined without meeting his eyes. He had lost more weight. His collared shirt, the grey one he wore on most days, had developed a gap at the collar where it used to sit flush against his neck. Then Mahad mentioned the gathering. He didn't describe it as a Khat session. He described it as a meeting at a friend's place. Men from the neighbourhood, some former teachers, some in other work, getting together on a Thursday evening to talk and relax. He had been going for a few months, he said. It helped him think clearly. Abdi should come if he wanted. There was no pressure in the invitation. Mahad said it once and did not repeat it. Abdi went. The room was on the second floor of a residential building 2 streets behind the central market. 8 men were already there when Abdi arrived, sitting on thin mattresses arranged along 3 walls, shoes left at the door, a tray of glasses with tea in the centre of the floor. The windows were open. A ceiling fan turned slowly. The air smelled of something green and slightly bitter, sharp in the back of the throat, not unpleasant. The Khat was already being distributed when Abdi sat down. Each man received a bundle, stems and leaves wrapped loosely, the leaves dark green and slightly glossy. The fresher ones near the top of the bunch a lighter, brighter shade that almost glowed under the ceiling light. Abdi was handed a bundle without ceremony, without anyone asking if he wanted it, the way you hand someone a cup of tea in a room where everyone is drinking tea. He held it in his lap and watched. The ritual was specific. Men selected leaves from the top of the bunch first, the youngest, most potent growth, called Khat in Somali, though the plant carries different names in different countries. They folded 2 or 3 leaves together, tucked them into the left cheek, and began to chew slowly, not swallowing, building a bolus of softened leaf material against the gum. The chewing was rhythmic and unhurried. Men talked while they chewed. The bolus moved, the jaw worked, the conversation continued. It looked to a first-time observer almost meditative. Abdi chewed his first leaves 20 minutes after arriving. He did not decide to. There was no clear moment of decision. The bundle was in his hands. The room had a particular ease to it. The men around him were relaxed and articulate, and not demonstrating any visible distress. And the leaves were simply there, and then they were in his mouth. Nothing happened for the first 30 minutes. He felt mild, a little alert, possibly just from the novelty of the situation. He drank his tea. He listened to the conversation, men talking about the economic situation, about a construction project near the airport, about a wedding the following week. Ordinary things, discussed with a quality of attention that seemed slightly amplified, as if each topic had been brought into slightly sharper focus than usual. Then, at roughly the 40-minute mark, something shifted. The shift was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was more like a change in lighting than a change in the room. Everything the same, but clearer. His thoughts, which had been circling the salary suspension and the tutoring schedule and the loan from his father for weeks, suddenly felt manageable, not solved, manageable. The anxiety that had been sitting in his chest since February, constant and low grade, like a held note he had stopped hearing because it never stopped, quietly reduced. He was still aware of every problem. He simply felt, for the first time in months, adequate to them. He stayed for 3 hours. Walking home, he felt the clarity beginning to thin at the edges, the problems reasserting their actual dimensions. But the feeling left a memory. That was the mechanism. Not the high itself, but the memory of adequacy. The knowledge that the state was achievable, that it existed, that he had been inside it, and could be inside it again. He was home by 11. He sat at his desk and graded 14 essay papers before he noticed the time. They were the best annotations he'd written all year. He used more blue ink than red. He went back on the following Monday. On his own, without Mahad, without being invited a second time. He went because he knew where the room was, and because the door would be open, and because the leaves would be there. This is the detail that matters. 4 days. The gap between first use and independent return was 4 days. Cathinone, the primary stimulant in fresh cat leaves, works on the brain's reward circuitry by triggering the release of dopamine and inhibiting its reuptake, producing a state of elevated mood, increased energy, and sharpened concentration that peaks roughly 90 minutes after ingestion and lasts 2 to 4 hours. The neurochemical signature of this process is not identical to methamphetamine, but it is not the distant cousin the drug's defenders describe either. It is close enough that the withdrawal from daily cathinone exposure produces a recognizable crash, fatigue, low mood, difficulty concentrating, that, in a person already under financial stress, in a city where Khat is available on every street corner, creates a pull that does not require any conscious decision to follow. Abdi did not know this. Nobody in the room had told him. Mahad had not warned him. The vendor who sold Abdi his first personal bundle 3 weeks later did not warn him. The information existed in international pharmacology journals, in WHO technical documents, in a handful of academic papers produced by researchers at universities in Nairobi and London. It did not exist in any form accessible to a 25-year-old teacher in Hargeisa, counting shillings and trying to stay functional. He bought his own bundle on a Wednesday afternoon in March 2017. The vendor was a young man who worked from a wooden cart parked at the corner of 2 streets in the Mohammed Haibe district, the same corner Abdi passed twice daily. The vendor wrapped the bundle in a banana leaf, which was standard. The leaf slowed moisture loss, extended freshness by an hour or 2. He took Abdi's money, counted it without looking down at it, tucked it into his waistband. The transaction took less time than buying a cup of tea. Abdi tucked the bundle under his left arm. The banana leaf was cool and slightly waxy against the inside of his elbow. He turned toward home. His father's hardware shop was visible from that corner, the blue-painted sign, the metal goods stacked in the open doorway, Hassan himself visible in profile behind the counter, talking to a customer. Abdi turned right instead of left. The long way home. 12 extra minutes through a street he rarely used. He did not think about why. His feet simply took the longer route without instruction, and he let them, and the bundle stayed cool under his arm, and he did not look back at the blue sign. He would not think about that detour for a long time. Later, he would think about almost nothing else. The Khat supply chain that fed Hargeisa every morning was one of the most precisely engineered informal logistics operations in East Africa, and almost nobody outside of it thought of it that way. It began in the highlands around Harar, in eastern Ethiopia, a region where the altitude sits between 1,500 and 2,000 meters. The rainfall is reliable, and the red-brown soil produces khat of a potency and freshness that traders in Djibouti, Somaliland and Somalia paid premium prices to access. Farmers there had been cultivating khat for generations, but the modern supply chain, the one that put fresh leaves on Hargeisa street corners before 7 in the morning, was a product of the post-1991 period, when the collapse of the Somali state created simultaneous demand explosion and supply vacuum that Ethiopian growers and Somali traders jointly, rapidly filled. The leaves were cut before dawn. This was not tradition, it was chemistry. Cathinone degrades rapidly after harvesting. Its potency drops measurably within hours at room temperature, which is why the entire supply chain was structured around a single constraint: speed. Cut, bundle, load, drive. The trucks left the Hara highlands in darkness, crossed the Ethiopian plateau, descended through the border town of Togwajale, and arrived in Hargeisa in the early morning. The journey was roughly 500 kilometers on roads that were, in places, not roads in any engineering sense of the word. The drivers did not stop. They could not stop. The cargo had an expiration time measured in hours, not days. By the time the bundles reached Hargeisa's wholesale distribution point, a covered area near the central bus terminal, chaotic from the outside and precisely organised from within, they had been in transit for 4 to 6 hours. Wholesalers arrived before the trucks did. Retail vendors arrived as the trucks were unloading. The entire distribution process, from truck arrival to vendor departure with purchased stock, typically took under 90 minutes. The leaves went from Ethiopian highland soil to a Hargeisa street corner in a single morning, still faintly cool, still carrying the smell of altitude and irrigation water. This system employed, directly or indirectly, an estimated 40,000 people in the corridor between eastern Ethiopia and Somaliland. Farmers, bundlers, truck drivers, border handlers, wholesalers, retail vendors, and the network of young men on foot who carried bundles to customers who did not come to the market themselves. It was faster and more reliable than most of the formal economic infrastructure in the region. It had never received a government subsidy. It had never needed one. Abdi understood none of this machinery when he first started buying. He knew the vendor's corner, the price, the banana leaf wrapping. That was enough. That was all the interface the system required from its end users. By the late spring of 2017, Abdi was chewing every afternoon. The sessions had migrated from the room behind the market to his own rented space. He had moved out of his parents' house in April, earlier than the 4-year calculation had projected by borrowing money he did not yet have against tutoring income he was counting on, but had not secured. The apartment was small, 1 room, a separate kitchen, a shared bathroom down the hall. The walls were unfinished concrete. The window faced another building's wall. It cost 120,000 shillings per month, which was more than his suspended school salary, and required the tutoring to not merely supplement his income but constitute it entirely. He told himself the chewing was temporary. He told himself this the way a man tells himself he will fix a leaking roof after the rain's end, with genuine intention, specific enough to feel like a plan, vague enough that no particular day ever becomes the day. The mafresh, the dedicated cat chewing room, was the social institution Abdi had entered without knowing its name. In Somaliland and Somalia, a mafresh was typically a rented room, or a section of a house where men gathered specifically to chew, furnished with thin floor mattresses, small tables for tea glasses, and nothing else. Some were commercial operations, a few shillings per session for the space. Others were informal, running out of someone's apartment. The social architecture of a mefresh session was consistent regardless of location. Men arrived, chewed, talked, and stayed for as long as the leaves and the alertness lasted. The conversation moved through religion, politics, business, grievance, and memory in a particular rotating sequence that regular attendees recognized without acknowledging. There was a hierarchy, unspoken but functional. Men who had been chewing longest, who knew the best sources, who could identify quality by the colour and moisture of the leaf. These men occupied the better positions against the back wall. New arrivals sat near the door. The progression inward happened over weeks and months as faces became familiar and the group's internal logic became readable. Abdi moved inward faster than most. He was articulate during sessions, which Khat rewarded. The drug-sharpened language for a few hours made connections feel more vivid, made the speaker feel more worth listening to. He was also a teacher, which in these rooms carried a residual respect that his salary had never reflected. Mahad was at the sessions too. Not everyone. He worked irregularly and his schedule was erratic, but enough that Abdi saw him twice a week on average. Something had changed in Mahad since the school's salary suspension. He was thinner in a way that was now visible in his face, not just in his collar. His speech had acquired a slight delay, a half-second pause before sentences began, as if each word was being retrieved from slightly farther away than before. He laughed more than he had during their lunch conversations at school, but the laughter arrived at unexpected moments, sometimes disconnected from what had just been said. Abdi noticed this. He did not name it. Now, the second person whose story runs parallel to Abdi's, though she would never meet him and did not know his name for years. Dr. Layla Osman Noor had been working in addiction psychiatry in Addis Ababa since 2014. She was 38, Somali Ethiopian, born in Dire Dawa to a Somali father and an Oromo mother, educated in Addis and then in Nairobi, where she completed her psychiatric residency at Kenyatta National Hospital. She had not set out to specialise in Khat. She had set out to work in trauma psychiatry. The Horn of Africa generated sufficient trauma to sustain a career, and Khat had arrived in her practice sideways, the way secondary diagnoses often do, accumulating behind the primary one until it was no longer secondary. Her ward at the Emmanuel Mental Health Hospital in Addis Ababa had 12 beds. The waiting list, as of early 2017, was 38 people. Not 38 people waiting for a bed to open. 38 people who had been assessed, confirmed as requiring inpatient care, and were being held in a queue because there were 12 beds and 12 beds only, and discharges happened slowly because the conditions that brought people to her ward did not resolve on any schedule that accommodated administrative convenience. She'd begun to notice, over the preceding 2 years, a pattern in new admissions that she could not find described in the existing clinical literature. Patients were arriving younger. The average age at admission had dropped from 34 in 2014 to 28 in 2016. They were arriving with more severe psychotic symptoms at intake, and critically, they were arriving faster after reported first use. In 2014, the average time between a patient's reported first Khat use and their first psychiatric hospitalization was 7 years. By 2016, that average had compressed to 4 years. She had 3 patients that year who had gone from first use to acute psychosis in under 18 months. She raised this at a department meeting. The senior psychiatrist chairing the meeting acknowledged it as interesting and moved to the next agenda item. Layla went back to her office and opened a spreadsheet she'd been building in her own time, on her own laptop, using her own intake forms cross-referenced with patient histories. She had 41 cases going back to 2014. She began building a 42nd. The question driving her was specific. Was the Khat being cultivated and sold in 2016 and 2017 more potent than the Khat of a decade earlier? Farmers in the Harar region and elsewhere had been under sustained commercial pressure to maximise yield and potency. The market paid more for fresh, high cathinone leaf. New cultivation techniques, including more intensive irrigation and closer planting, had been adopted across large portions of the growing region. Nobody had systematically tested whether these agricultural changes had altered the neurochemical profile of the harvested plant. The studies did not exist. The funding to conduct them did not exist. The regulatory framework that might have motivated such testing did not exist. Layla wrote a 3-page research proposal and submitted it to the Ethiopian Public Health Institute, the East African branch of a European Global Health Foundation, and a Nairobi-based research consortium that had previously funded her trauma work. She received 3 rejection letters over the following 6 months. 2 cited lack of available funding. 1 noted that Khat was a regulated legal commodity in Ethiopia and that research framing it as a public health threat required a higher evidentiary threshold before funding could be allocated. She filed the rejections in a folder she labelled, without irony, later. Back in Hargeisa, summer of 2017. Abdi's school did not reopen in September. The headmaster sent a text message to all staff informing them that the school was officially suspending operations pending a financial restructuring that had no announced timeline. The suspended salaries, now 5 months of back pay for most staff, were listed in the message as a debt that the school owner intended to honour. That intention was never converted into payment. Abdi was now entirely dependent on tutoring income. He had 4 regular students, which generated approximately 80,000 shillings per month in a good month. His rent was 120,000. The gap was covered by a sequence of loans, from his father, from a cousin, from a neighbour who charged no interest but expected repayment within 30 days, which Abdi managed once and then missed. He was chewing every day. He still believed it was temporary. The sessions now started earlier. Originally, the afternoon gathering had begun around 3, after the morning's work, before the evening's obligations. By August, Abdi was starting by 1 o'clock. The quality of the leaves mattered to him now in a way it hadn't before. He had developed preferences. He wanted the highland variety, the lighter green leaves from the top of the bunch, not the darker, more fibrous stems that older or lower grade batches were padded out with. He knew which vendors carried which sources. He had walked to a different vendor than his usual corner twice in 1 week, when the corner cart was running low on quality stock. He was spending 40,000 shillings a week on Khat. That number, if written on a page and placed next to his tutoring income, would have ended the story there. He didn't write it on a page. He didn't add the weekly totals into a monthly figure. He bought each day's supply as a separate transaction, a separate small decision, never accumulating into the larger number it actually was. The apartment was quiet in the evenings after the session ended. The alertness drained out over 2 or 3 hours, replaced by a flatness that was not quite sadness, but occupied the same space. Abdi would sit on the mattress. He had not bought a bed frame, and the papers he intended to grade for his remaining tutoring students sat on the floor beside him, and he would think clearly about grading them without actually doing it. And then it would be midnight, and then 2 in the morning, and the inability to sleep that came in the post-session hours meant he would still be lying on the mattress at 3, staring at the ceiling, and in the morning the grogginess would be dense and specific, located behind his eyes, and the thing that cleared it most effectively was beginning the day's supply earlier than the day before. He had 1 tutoring student cancel in September. The family had decided to move their child to a different tutor. One who was more reliably present, the father said, which was a careful way of saying that Abdi had twice arrived late and once not arrived at all. He had another student cancel in October. He did not tell his father. On a Thursday evening in late October, he was at a Mafresh session with a group that included 3 men he had not met before, new arrivals to that particular room, introduced by someone whose name he had already forgotten. The conversation moved through the usual rotation. Abdi spoke at length about the education system, about his plans to resume teaching, about a school in the Gabili district he had heard was hiring. He spoke well. He felt persuasive and clear and purposeful. The 3 new men listened, and one of them nodded with what looked like genuine respect. Walking home afterward, Abdi could not reconstruct a single specific sentence he had said. The words had felt real, entirely real. The clarity had been indistinguishable from actual clarity. But the content, gone, not fading, not fragmenting, just absent, as if it had occurred to someone else in a room he'd only watched from outside. He stopped on the pavement. The street was empty. A single streetlight buzzed overhead. He stood there for a moment, trying to retrieve something, anything. The nodding man's face. A word, a phrase. One concrete thing from 2 hours of feeling entirely coherent. Nothing came. He walked home. He didn't note this in any way. No writing it down, no telling anyone, no naming it even privately as something worth examining. He was tired. He would be clearer tomorrow. There was a bundle left from this afternoon session that he had wrapped back up and placed in the small tin on the kitchen shelf. Not quite enough for a full session, but enough for the morning. That was what he thought about walking home. The tin on the shelf, not the missing 2 hours. The confrontation happened on a Friday in November 2018. Abdi had come to his parents' house for the first time in 6 weeks. Not by invitation, but because his phone had been cut off for non-payment and he needed to borrow money in person, which required being in person, which required the walk through the Shab neighbourhood he had been finding reasons to avoid. He arrived in the early afternoon. His mother opened the door, looked at his face for 2 seconds, and went to get Hassan without saying anything to Abdi at all. Hassan came out of the back room where he kept his accounting ledgers. He looked at his son the way a man looks at a structural crack in a wall he built himself, not with surprise, but with a particular dread that comes from having suspected this for longer than he admitted. Abdi had lost 9 kilograms since the last time Hassan had seen him. His cheekbones were prominent in a way that changed the geometry of his face. His eyes had the specific quality of eyes that have not had uninterrupted sleep in weeks. Not red, not swollen, just slightly too open, the lids not quite tracking at the right speed. Hassan did not ask how Abdi was. He already knew. What followed was not an argument. Arguments require 2 people with roughly equal purchase on the exchange. What followed was Hassan speaking at length, specifically, naming every man he had watched Khat destroy, recounting the timeline he'd been observing in his own son from a distance, laying out what he believed would happen next with the precise confidence of a man who had watched the same sequence run to completion in other lives. He named his brother. He named 3 men from the mosque. He named dates. Abdi listened. He nodded in the right places. He agreed with everything his father said, not as performance but as genuine cognitive assent. He could follow every argument, recognize every point, confirm every observation as accurate. His mind was clear enough for that. Agreement cost him nothing. He left with 50,000 shillings and a promise to come back the following Friday. He bought Khat on the way home. Not immediately. He walked 4 blocks first, the money folded in his shirt pocket, the afternoon heat pressing down on the unpaved section of road between the main street and his building. He lasted 4 blocks. Then he stopped at the cart he now used exclusively, the one run by a young man named Bile, who knew Abdi's preference for Highland leaf, and often set aside a better quality bundle when he saw Abdi coming. Bile handed him the bundle without being asked. He took Abdi's money and put it directly in his front pocket without counting it, because he already knew the amount. 2 days later, Abdi's father's warning had not faded. It was still intact, retrievable, accurate. He could repeat it back verbatim. He could explain exactly why it was correct. He chewed while thinking about how correct it was. This was not stupidity. It was not weakness in any simple sense. It was the specific neurological condition that sustained stimulant dependence creates. A state where the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for translating intention into action, is functionally decoupled from the limbic system driving the craving. The person knows. The knowledge does not reach the behavior. These are two separate systems, and in a brain that has reorganized its dopamine architecture around a daily chemical input, they do not reliably communicate. The clinical term for this is impaired inhibitory control. In the room behind the market, in the Mafresh sessions, in every Khat economy across East Africa, it was simply called being a man who chews. Now the thing the viewer knows, and Abdi does not. 3 streets from Abdi's apartment, behind the hardware shop with the blue sign, there was a small room that Hassan Wassim had built as a storeroom when he first opened the shop in 2004. It was 8 feet by 6 feet, packed originally with overflow inventory, extra piping, bulk wire, the things that wouldn't fit on the main shelves. Over the years, the inventory had been reorganized and the storeroom had emptied out, except for a low wooden platform along one wall, a folded prayer mat, a small radio, and a tin. The tin contained Khat. Hassan Wassim had been chewing in that room, alone, every evening after closing, for 11 years. 11 years of public condemnation. 11 years of naming names from the mosque, of citing his brother's collapsed shop, of warning his sons with the specific authority of a man speaking from the outside of something looking in. Every Friday sermon about the degradation of men who wasted their evenings on leaves, Hassan had heard sitting in the front third of the mosque where regulars sat, and had felt genuinely that the sermon was true, because the sermon was about other men, men who chewed in public, in mafreshes, in groups, visibly and openly and at the expense of their families. What he did alone in a locked room after work, quietly, without neglecting a single obligation, that was a different thing. He had never named it the same thing. He chewed approximately 200 grams per evening. He bought from a vendor 3 neighborhoods away, a deliberate distance, far enough that no one who knew him as Hassan Wassim of the hardware shop would see the transaction. He had done this for so long that it no longer felt like concealment. It felt like routine. His hands did not shake. His weight was stable. His business ran without interruption. He prayed 5 times a day. He was home for dinner. By every external measure and by his own internal accounting, the Khat had not damaged him. He believed this completely. He also knew, with a particular knowledge of someone who has held 2 contradictory things in the same mind for 11 years, that he could not stop. He had tried twice. Once for 3 weeks in 2012 after a particularly pointed Friday sermon, and once for 9 days in 2015 when Samir came home for a holiday and Hassan found himself manufacturing reasons to stay at the shop late, grinding with anxiety at the disruption to his routine. Both times he had returned without telling anyone he had tried. Now his son was collapsing in front of him, and Hassan was giving speeches. This is the loop the viewer carries and Abdi does not. What happens to the speech, to the father, to the architecture of this family when Abdi eventually finds out? He would find out, but not yet. In Addis Ababa, Layla's ward filled and emptied and filled again with a rhythm that bore no relationship to recovery timelines and everything to do with bed pressure. She discharged patients she would have preferred to keep. She admitted patients she did not have the staff to treat properly. Her 12 beds had become, in practice, a revolving door for the acute phase of Khat-induced psychosis. Stabilize, discharge, wait for readmission. The readmission rate within 12 months was 61%. She had calculated this herself. It was not in any official report. A new patient arrived in November 2018, a 22-year-old from Dawa, referred by a district clinic that had correctly identified psychosis and incorrectly attributed it to cannabis. His name was not Abdi. His story was not Abdi's story, but his trajectory. First use at 19, daily use by 20, hospitalization by 22, was now the third case in Layla's growing file, where the timeline from first use to acute psychosis had collapsed to under 3 years. She updated her spreadsheet. 47 cases now. The compression of the timeline was accelerating, not stabilizing. She submitted a revised version of her research proposal to a global mental health funding body based in Geneva. The proposal was 8 pages. She had reframed the central question, no longer asking whether Khat was more potent than before, which the reviewers had apparently found too politically charged, but asking instead why the age of onset for Khat-related psychiatric admission was falling across East Africa. Same data, different framing, less confrontational as an opening position, more likely to get past the first review filter. She sent it on a Wednesday evening, and then sat in her office for a while without doing anything, which was unusual for her. The ward was quiet. The overnight nurse was doing rounds. Through the window, the lights of Addis spread out to the south, thick in the valley, thinner as the ground rose. She was building something, she knew. The shape of it was not yet visible. The data existed. The pattern was real. What she did not yet have, what she would not have for another 2 years, was the piece that would make it undeniable. Back in Hargeisa. Back to the arithmetic. By the end of 2018, Abdi had 2 remaining tutoring students, down from 5 earlier in the year. His income was approximately 45,000 shillings per month. His rent was 120,000. The gap between those 2 numbers was covered entirely by debt. He owed his father 80,000 shillings he had borrowed in 3 separate instalments. He owed his cousin Farhan 40,000. He owed his neighbour Hudden, the one with the 30-day repayment window, 60,000 that was now 90 days overdue. He had sold a portable gas stove he no longer used, a pair of shoes that were too good for where his life was currently happening, and a small battery-powered radio that had been a gift from Samir 3 years earlier. Samir called on Sunday evenings, now from a cheaper phone because his scholarship had not been renewed, and he was working part-time at a printing shop in Addis to cover living expenses while finishing his degree. The calls were short. Abdi's side of them was mostly affirmative sounds and brief reassurances. Samir in Addis knew something was wrong. He did not know what. He did not know what questions to ask, and the answers he received were technically accurate. Yes, I'm working. Yes, things are difficult. Yes, it will improve. And told him nothing. The last tutoring student cancelled in January 2019. Abdi received the cancellation by a note slipped under his door. The father's handwriting, apologetic, citing a family relocation. Abdi read it standing in his doorway in the morning, in the particular flat light of early January, still in the clothes he'd slept in, his jaw slightly sore from the previous day's chewing. He had no income. He had no incoming income. He stood in the doorway for a moment holding the note. His mind ran the arithmetic, or started to, and then didn't finish, because finishing it produced a number that had no solution. He folded the note once. He put it in the same drawer as the teaching certificate and the 4-year calculation sheet, and the utility bill he had not paid, and the letter from Hoden's husband that was not friendly in its language. Then he went to the kitchen shelf. The tin was empty. He had known it was empty before he went to the kitchen. He had checked it the previous night. He checked it again now, lifting the lid, looking inside at the bare metal floor of the tin. His body registered the emptiness in a specific physical way, a tightening across the chest, a concentration of attention that gathered itself around the single fact of absence. He had 4,300 shillings in his wallet. Enough for one bundle. Not a good one, but enough. He was out the door before he had formed a complete thought about going. In the shop 3 streets away, behind a locked door, in the storeroom that smelled of wire and old inventory and dry leaves, Hassan Wersam sat on his low wooden platform. The radio played at low volume. His jaw worked steadily. He had left the shop front to his part-time assistant for the evening. He was thinking about his son. He would stop, he thought. He would stop and go to Abdi and do something real this time. Not a speech, not borrowed money, something structural. He would stop first, tomorrow. He would stop chewing tomorrow, and then he would know how to talk to Abdi from the inside of the thing rather than performing from the outside. He had thought this before. The specific thought, tomorrow, had a worn quality, like a word repeated until it lost its referent. The radio played. The leaves were almost gone. Hassan reached into the bundle for one more stem. Tomorrow, he thought. Outside, 4 streets away, Abdi was already walking back from the vendor's cart, the bundle under his arm, moving quickly, not looking at the blue sign. 2019 arrived in Hargeisa the way bad years often do, indistinguishable at first from any other year. The same morning trucks, the same dry heat, the same calls to prayer layered over generator noise. The difference accumulated slowly, then all at once. Abdi's debt by February stood at 310,000 shillings across 4 creditors. His rent was 4 months overdue. His landlord, a patient man named Kabdi Zassan, who owned 3 properties in the district and had known Abdi's father for a decade, had come to the door twice. The first time he accepted a partial payment and a firm date for the balance. The second time there was no payment and no date, and Kabdi Zassan stood in the doorway looking at the room behind Abdi. The bare walls, the mattress on the floor, the absence of any furniture that could be sold, and did the calculation himself without speaking it. Abdi was spending 48,000 shillings per week on Khat. He had no income. These 2 facts coexisted in his daily life without producing the crisis response they should have produced, because each day's purchase felt like a single small decision, rather than the installment of a catastrophe it actually was. The debt had to come from somewhere. It came from everywhere simultaneously. A system of informal borrowing that exploited every available relationship until those relationships either held or broke. His father continued to lend, though the amounts had decreased and the intervals between Hassan's questions had shortened in a way that communicated, without stating it, that the money was not expected back. His cousin Farhan stopped answering the phone after the 3rd unanswered loan. Hodon, the neighbour, sent her husband to knock on Abdi's door on a Tuesday evening, and the husband's knock was not a knock so much as a sustained, deliberate impact that could be heard from the street. Abdi was not home. He was at a mafresh session 7 blocks away. The place he now attended was not the room behind the market where he had started. That room still operated, but Abdi had drifted to a different circuit, a network of sessions that clustered around a wholesale supplier named Yusuf Dahir Shia, whose operation had become, over the preceding 2 years, the de facto hub of Khat distribution across a wide section of northern Hargeisa. Yusuf was 35. He'd been in the Khat trade since he was 19, starting as a delivery runner for a larger wholesaler, then managing a retail stall, then acquiring his own supply connections across the Ethiopian border. By 2019, he ran a wholesale operation that moved product to 11 retail vendors, and also ran his own informal retail arm for a select group of regular customers, men who bought in bulk, bought reliably, and were known quantities. He employed 6 people. His wife ran a small food stall in the market. He had 2 daughters in school. He was, by the standards of the informal economy in which he operated, successful. He was also the person who had quietly extended credit to at least 9 of his regular customers when they could no longer pay up front. The credit system was not written down anywhere. It was maintained entirely in Yusef's memory and in the mutual understanding that the debt was real, that it accumulated interest in the form of obligation rather than a stated rate, and that the easiest way to service it was to keep buying. Because a customer who kept buying was a customer whose debt could be rolled forward indefinitely, and a customer who stopped buying was a customer whose debt became immediately and inconveniently due. Abdi had been on Yusef's credit by March 2019. He received his bundles in the morning, paid what he had, and the difference was noted without ceremony. Yusef simply remembered the number, updated it in whatever internal ledger he maintained behind his eyes, and handed over the leaves. There was no confrontation in this, no coercion in any form that would be recognized as such. Just the clean, functional logic of a supplier who understood that his most dependent customers were also his most reliable ones, and that reliability, in this trade, was worth carrying a balance. By June, Abdi owed Yusef 180,000 shillings. Mahad deteriorated visibly and rapidly through the first half of 2019. He had stopped attending sessions at a fixed location. He moved between gatherings, sometimes appearing at the Mafresh near the bus terminal, sometimes at private sessions in rooms Abdi had never visited, sometimes simply on the street, chewing from a bundle he carried unwrapped in his hand. His speech had developed beyond the half-second delay into something more fragmented, sentences that began with clarity and lost their structure before reaching the end, thoughts abandoned mid-construction. He laughed at things that were not said aloud. He had developed the habit of touching the wall when he walked down a street, dragging his fingers along every surface as if navigating by texture. Abdi saw him twice in April and once in May. The May encounter was on a side street near the central market. Mahad walking toward him, not recognizing Abdi until they were 4 feet apart, then recognizing him suddenly and completely, grabbing his arm with a grip that was stronger than his frame suggested, talking quickly about something that Abdi could not follow, a story about a school or a debt, or a man who owed him something, the reference shifting mid-sentence so that it was impossible to track what the story was actually about. Abdi walked home afterward and sat on his mattress. He did not think about Mahad's fingers on his arm. He did not think about the wall touching, the lost sentences, the eyes that recognized him a moment too late. He thought about the bundle he had left half finished on the floor and whether it had dried out enough to have lost potency. He checked it. It hadn't. He kept chewing. He didn't make the comparison that was available to him. This is the mechanism that sustained addiction studies call anosognosia, not denial in a psychological sense, not a choice to look away, but a genuine neurological diminishment of the capacity to recognize one's own symptoms. The brain that is damaged by a substance becomes, through that same damage, less capable of perceiving the damage. The insight required to see the problem is located in the same architecture the problem is dismantling. Abdi could see Mahad clearly. He could not see himself. In Addis Ababa, Layla received a response from the Geneva-based funding body in April 2019. Not a rejection this time, a request for additional data supporting the age of onset compression she'd described. They wanted her to demonstrate the pattern with a larger sample. 12 cases at the extreme end, they noted, was a suggestive cluster, but not a statistically robust finding. They needed 30 minimum, ideally 50, with complete intake data including reported first-use dates, family corroboration where available, and documentation of any alternative diagnoses that had been ruled out. Layla had 49 cases in her spreadsheet. Not all of them had complete intake data. Family corroboration was available for roughly half. The problem was not the number of cases. She could reach 50 without difficulty. The problem was that building complete files for each case required going back through records that were partial, handwritten, and in some instances stored in folders that had been water damaged during a roof leak in the records room 2 winters earlier. She spent 3 months rebuilding files. She did this in the evenings after ward rounds, at a desk in the records room working from whatever survived. A date here, a name there, a referring clinic's handwritten note that gave a first-use estimate. She reconstructed what she could and documented explicitly what was missing and why. When she submitted the revised proposal in July 2019 with 53 cases and complete or near-complete data for 41 of them, it was the most precisely documented argument she had made in her career. The response came 8 weeks later. The funding body was interested. A preliminary grant for a 6-month data collection phase had been approved, €14,000, which was not enough for what the research actually required, but was enough to begin. She read the email twice at her desk. Then she went to the ward for the evening round, because there was always an evening round, because the 12 beds were always full. The new Khat entering Hargeisa in 2019 was not the same product that had been sold there in 2015. Layla's unconfirmed hypothesis about cultivation changes was, in fact, correct, though she did not yet have the lab analysis to prove it. The high-yield farming technique spreading through the Hara growing region had produced a leaf with a measurably higher cathinone concentration. Early field testing by an Ethiopian agricultural research station, buried in a quarterly report that nobody in the public health community had read, suggested concentrations up to 30% higher than baseline measurements from a decade earlier, 30% more potent. Delivered into a market of millions of daily users, none of whom had been informed, none of whom had adjusted their consumption to account for the change, and many of whom, like Abdi, were already consuming quantities that assumed the older, lower potency as their baseline. Abdi's sleep had collapsed entirely by the second half of 2019. Not degraded, collapsed. He was sleeping in fragments of 2 to 3 hours at irregular intervals, sometimes during the day after a session, sometimes in the early morning after a night of wakefulness. The continuous restorative sleep that the brain requires for memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and cellular repair had not happened for him in months. His face showed it in the way faces show sustained sleep deprivation, not tiredness, which is temporary and visible, but a deeper depletion that altered the muscle tone around his eyes and jaw, a permanent seeming fatigue that no single night of sleep would address. He had lost 18 kilograms since 2017. His belt had 3 new holes punched in it with a nail. His landlord, Kabdi Zassan, removed Abdi's belongings from the apartment in August 2019 and stacked them in the courtyard. This was not legal under Somaliland's informal tenancy norms, but it was common, and Abdi was 4 months behind, and Kabdi Zassan had a family of his own. Abdi came home to his mattress, his 2 bags of clothes, and his drawer contents in a cardboard box sitting on the courtyard's dusty ground. He stood looking at it for a moment in the early evening heat. The teaching certificate was in the cardboard box in its plastic sleeve. He picked it up and checked that the sleeve was intact. He spent 2 nights sleeping at the Mafresh near the bus terminal, where the owner allowed men to stay if they'd bought that day. Then he moved into a room in a shared house in the Awabdal district. 5 men, 3 rooms, a single water tap in the outdoor courtyard, 400 shillings a night paid daily, which was the only arrangement available to a person who could not commit to a monthly payment. The room smelled of the previous occupant's cigarettes. The window didn't close fully. He told his father he had moved to a better apartment. He gave Hassan a false address. Yusuf Dahir Shir extended Abdi's credit again in September without being asked. He simply continued providing the morning bundle and updating the silent number. The balance by October was 240,000 shillings. Neither of them spoke about it directly. Abdi understood that the debt was real and that Yusuf's patience had a structure he could not fully see, that the extension of credit was not generosity but a form of architecture, a mechanism that kept the customer inside the system regardless of his financial position. Understanding this did not alter the morning walk to Yusuf's stall. In the shared house, Abdi had a neighbour, a young man named Daoud, who was not a Khat user, but who worked night shifts at a bakery and was therefore awake during the hours when Abdi was most activated by the afternoon session. They occupied adjacent corners of shared time without forming a friendship. But Daoud noticed things. He noticed that Abdi talked to himself sometimes in the early hours, not quietly but at a conversational volume, as if continuing a discussion that had been happening in another room. He noticed that Abdi would stop in the middle of the courtyard for minutes at a time, standing still, apparently looking at something that was not visible. He noticed that when he said Abdi's name from across the courtyard, there was sometimes a delay before Abdi registered it, a pause that was too long for distraction and too consistent to be coincidence. Daoud mentioned this to the house's informal manager, the man who collected the nightly payments, who shrugged and said it was Khat, and that Abdi always paid, and as long as he paid it was not a problem. He stopped paying in November. The same month, Samir Wasim finished his degree in Addis Ababa. He sent a photograph home, himself in front of the university's main building, holding the degree certificate, squinting slightly in the afternoon sun. He called that evening. Fadumo cried. Hassan said he was proud and meant it. Samir asked about Abdi. Hassan said Abdi was fine. He said it without inflection. After the call, Hassan sat in the hardware shop after closing. His assistant had gone. The street outside was quiet. He unlocked the storeroom and went inside. He sat on the wooden platform. He looked at the tin. He did not open it. He sat there for a long time in the dark. The next morning he made a phone call to a man he knew, a community elder who had some connection to a clinic in the Shaab neighbourhood that dealt with addiction cases. He asked in general terms about what help was available for someone in Abdi's situation. The elder told him about a clinic, gave him a name. Hassan wrote the name on the back of a receipt and put it in his shirt pocket. He did not call the clinic. He did not tell Abdi about the receipt. He opened the tin that evening. 3 streets away, in the direction of the bus terminal, a truck from Ethiopia was making its early delivery. Headlights cutting through the pre-dawn dark, the back loaded with fresh bundles, still cold from the Highland night, the leaves inside at their peak potency, the cathinone intact, the cargo arriving on schedule as it always did, as it had every morning for years, regardless of what was happening in the rooms and houses and shared courtyard beds that waited for it. Somewhere in those rooms, Abdi was awake. He had not slept. He was waiting for the vendor's stall to open with the specific, focused patience of a man whose entire circadian system had reorganized itself around a single daily event. At dawn, the stall opened. He was the first customer. The vendor did not find this unusual. Abdi had been the first customer every morning for the past 3 weeks. What the vendor did notice, and mention to no one because it was not his business, was that Abdi had started talking during the transaction. Not to him, exactly. Not to anyone visible. Just talking quietly, in a continuous low murmur, while his money was counted and his bundle was wrapped and handed over, as if the conversation had been running before he arrived and would continue after he left. The vendor wrapped the bundle. Abdi took it. He walked back toward the shared house with the particular purposeful stride of a man who knows exactly where he is going and has no clear idea why. In Addis Ababa, Layla was already at her desk. Her €14,000 preliminary grant had arrived 2 weeks earlier. She had used it to hire a part-time research assistant and to fund travel for 4 field interviews in Hargeisa, which she had not yet conducted because the security assessment for the trip was still pending, and because her ward had admitted 3 new acute cases in 10 days, and she could not leave during an intake surge. She opened her spreadsheet. 53 cases. She added a column she'd been thinking about for weeks, one she'd resisted adding because its implications made the data harder to present to funding bodies without triggering political objections. The column was titled, Correct Diagnosis on File, Y/N. She worked through the cases one by one. By the time she finished, the answer was N for 31 of the 53. 31 people whose Khat-induced psychosis had been recorded, treated and filed as something else entirely: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, substance-induced mood disorder, unspecified. The misdiagnosis did not happen because the doctors were incompetent. It happened because Khat psychosis and primary psychosis are clinically indistinguishable in the acute phase without a detailed substance history, and substance histories in these populations were rarely obtained systematically, and the diagnostic categories available in the facilities treating these patients were blunt instruments applied under severe resource pressure by clinicians who were doing their best with what existed. The 31 cases with wrong diagnoses had received treatment protocols designed for the wrong condition. Layla stared at the column for a while. Then she looked up the field interview trip to Hargeisa and sent an email asking to expedite the security assessment. She did not know Abdi Wassam's name yet. She did not know his address or his face, or the green stain on the wall of the room where he would eventually sit. But she was building something in that spreadsheet that was, cell by cell, moving toward him. Neither of them knew this. Layla's field trip to Hargeisa happened in February 2020, 2 weeks before the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic and international travel became a bureaucratic obstacle course that would have made the trip impossible a month later. She arrived on a Tuesday morning on a small regional carrier from Addis, carrying a laptop, 2 notebooks, a portable recorder, and a research protocol approved by the Emmanuel Hospital Ethics Board. She had 4 interviews scheduled. She conducted 7. The additional 3 came from a referral chain that activated the moment she sat down with her first contact, a clinic administrator at a small health centre in the Sharb neighbourhood who'd been quietly tracking Khat-related admissions for 3 years without any institutional mandate to do so, simply because the numbers were demanding to be tracked. That administrator knew a nurse at a second facility. The nurse knew a community health worker who operated in the Al Abdal district. Each person she met handed her the next name with an urgency that suggested they had been waiting for someone to show up and ask. What she gathered across those 7 interviews restructured the shape of her research entirely. The pattern was not what she'd expected. She had come to Hargeisa looking for evidence of increased Khat potency and its psychiatric consequences, a pharmacological story with a public health conclusion. What she found instead was a systemic story, and the system was more intricate and more entrenched than a simple supply and demand model could contain. The clinic administrator in Sharb had a specific piece of information that stopped Layla mid-note. There was a foundation operating in Hargeisa, registered with both the Somaliland Ministry of Finance and a European donor body, receiving international funding for Khat prevention and addiction awareness work, that had been operating for 4 years and had produced no measurable outcome in any metric the administrator could identify. No treatment beds funded, no awareness campaigns with documented reach, no trained community health workers. The Foundation's annual reports, which the administrator had obtained through a contact at the ministry, described activities in language so vague that it was impossible to verify whether any of them had occurred. The foundation was called Geed Kagar, green tree in Somali, and it had received across 4 years the equivalent of approximately $380,000 in donor funding. Layla wrote down the name. She underlined it twice. She spent her last evening in Hargeisa at an internet cafe, working through publicly available business registry records and donor disclosure databases, following the ownership and administrative trail that connected the names on the Geed Kagar Foundation's registration documents to other registered entities in the Somaliland Business Registry. This was not investigative journalism. It was pattern recognition applied to public documents, and it took 3 hours. What she found at the end of those 3 hours was this. The building in which the Geed Kagar Foundation maintained its administrative offices was owned by a holding company registered in 2015. That holding company had 2 listed shareholders. One was a property developer whose other holdings were in construction and retail. Unremarkable. The second shareholder held a 31% stake and was listed on the registry as a trading company involved in agricultural commodity import and distribution. Agricultural commodity import and distribution. She searched the trading company's name against the Somaliland customs and trade records that were publicly available in summary form on the Ministry of Trade's website. The commodity categories listed in its import licenses included fresh, perishable produce from Ethiopia. She sat back in the plastic chair of the internet cafe. Khat was legally classified in Somaliland as fresh produce. It moved across the Ethiopian border under produce import licenses. The trading company whose shareholder owned the building housing the Khat Prevention Foundation was, in all reasonable interpretation of its registration documents, involved in Khat wholesale distribution. The same money sent to reduce Khat consumption was administratively housed in a building owned by a company that profited from Khat consumption. She could not prove intent. The connection might be familial convenience, common in the region's business structures, rather than deliberate design. The Foundation's European donor might have conducted no due diligence on the building's ownership structure, which would be incompetence rather than complicity. 2 ownership layers separated the Foundation from the trading company, which provided legal insulation regardless of the practical reality. None of this changed what the structure produced. 4 years, $380,000, and not a single treatment bed. She flew back to Addis on Thursday morning. She opened a new document on her laptop at cruising altitude and began typing. She was not certain what she was writing. A section of her research paper, a report to the donor body, a confidential memo to someone she had not yet identified. She wrote for 90 minutes without stopping. The document had no title yet. She saved it under the file name GC and closed the laptop. She did not send it to anyone. Not yet. This was the piece that changed the geometry of everything she'd been building. The question now was not only why Khat psychosis was being misdiagnosed across East Africa, it was why the institutional infrastructure that should have been addressing the crisis was, in at least one documented case, structurally connected to the industry producing the crisis. And if it was true in one documented case, the question that followed was one she was not funded to investigate and not positioned to answer. How many other cases? She put the question in the back of the document, behind all the data. She went back to her ward. In Hargeisa, the same February that Layla was sitting in the internet cafe following ownership chains, Abdi Farhan Warsame was conducting the first continuous 36-hour chewing session of his life. It was not planned. There was no point at which he decided to push through a night. It simply happened that the group he was with on a Tuesday evening in a room near the Awabdal market did not disperse at the usual hour. Men came and went throughout the night. Fresh supply arrived at roughly 2 a.m, brought by someone whose name Abdi did not know. The session's rhythm sustained itself through the natural reinforcement of the drug, each new leaf extending the alertness just enough to defer the crash. the crash deferred long enough to make stopping feel unnecessary. By hour 20, Abdi had consumed approximately 400 grams of Khat. This was double his usual daily intake. The cathinone load in his system was at a level his brain had not previously processed in a single sustained window. By hour 26, the quality of his alertness had changed. It was still alertness. His eyes were open, his body upright, his speech continuous. But the content of his thoughts had acquired an associative quality that was no longer fully under his governance. Connections formed between things that were not connected. A conversation about a road construction project became, in his mind, linked to a memory of his classroom, which connected to a sense that some of his former students were nearby, not in the room, but close, audible if he listened carefully. He mentioned this to the man sitting next to him. The man was also in hour 26 of his own session, and did not find this unusual enough to respond to. At hour 30, Abdi heard something. Not a voice, precisely. A sound with the tonal quality of a voice. Directional, located somewhere to his left, below the level of the floorboards. Not words he could make out. Something underneath articulate speech, like language heard through water. He turned his head. The floorboards were bare and unexceptional. He looked at them for a long time. He told himself it was exhaustion. He was right. He was also wrong. It was exhaustion, and it was something else. The beginning of a neurological process that exhaustion was enabling but not causing. A sensitization of the dopaminergic pathways that, in a brain already reorganized by 3 years of daily cathinone exposure, had crossed a threshold into territory that would not simply resolve with sleep. He slept for 11 hours when the session finally ended. He woke in the early afternoon, disoriented about the day and the hour, his mouth sore, his jaw aching from hours of sustained chewing, a dull pain distributed across his temples. He lay on the mattress and let the room reassemble itself around him. The sounds were gone. He noted their absence with relief and did not examine what their presence had meant. 3 weeks later he heard them again. This time he was alone, mid-session, afternoon light coming through the window that didn't close fully. He was not at the 30-hour mark. He was at hour 4 of a normal session on a normal amount of Khat. The sound arrived without warning, the same tonal quality, directional again, this time from the courtyard outside rather than below the floor. He went to the window and looked out. The courtyard was empty except for Dord's bicycle leaning against the far wall. He closed the window. The sound continued for approximately 20 minutes, then stopped. He did not tell anyone. The gap between Abdi's internal experience and his outward presentation was now wide enough to be dangerous. From the outside, he was a man who had lost weight and income and housing stability and was visibly dependent on Khat. From the inside, he was a man managing a series of unusual perceptual events that he was categorizing as the side effects of extreme tiredness, and that he was not connecting to the drug, partly because he had no information framework that would allow that connection, and partly because making that connection would require acknowledging something about his situation that was not acknowledgeable. The household in Shab received a letter from Samir in March 2020. He was coming home. His degree was finished. His Addis life was ending. He had saved enough for a bus ticket and the first 2 months of a modest start in Hargeisa. He wrote to his parents about plans, a job application to the Somaliland Revenue Authority, possibly a role at a logistics company his university classmate's uncle managed. He did not write about Abdi directly. He asked about him in the last line, as a question, the way you ask about something you are already worried about and are not yet ready to have answered. Hassan read the letter at the shop. He read it twice. He looked at the receipt in his shirt pocket. A different receipt now, a newer one, because shirts got washed. but the name of the clinic and the contact written on each new receipt in the same handwriting, transferred from pocket to pocket for over a year, never acted upon. He folded the letter and called for Dumo to tell her Samir was coming. He did not call the clinic that day. He did not call it the next day either. Samir arrived in Hargeisa on a Wednesday in April 2020, carrying a backpack and a second-hand laptop in a padded sleeve. He was 23, taller than when he had left for Addis 6 years earlier, with the specific self-possession of someone who has managed their own life in a foreign city and learned, through that process, which parts of themselves were reliable. He saw his mother first. He ate. He slept. The next morning he asked his father where Abdi was. The answer Hassan gave was technically accurate and informationally empty. Abdi was in the Awabdal district. He was not well. He had been struggling. Hassan gave the false address Abdi had provided months earlier. Samir went to the address that afternoon. It was a closed shop with no residential space above it. He stood on the pavement in front of it for a moment, understanding what a false address meant, understanding that his father had given it to him without comment, which meant his father had known it was false and had not gone further. He spent the next 4 days asking around the Awabdal district, at the shared houses, at the Khat stalls, at the mafresh near the bus terminal. Everyone he asked knew who he meant. Nobody offered information freely, but nobody actively concealed it either. They pointed him, incrementally, toward the right street, the right building, the right door. When Samir knocked on that door on a Sunday morning, the man who opened it was his brother. He recognized Abdi by his eyes, and by the way he held his shoulders, and by the specific way he turned his head when he heard his name. Everything else was different. The weight gone. The jaw working a slow rhythm even without anything in it. A muscle memory the body was running without input. The room behind him visible through the half-open door. Mattress, bare floor, no furniture, 2 plastic bags in the corner, and on the windowsill a small tin. Samir stood in the doorway. He did not speak for a moment. He was looking at his brother the way you look at something when you're trying to map what you're seeing onto what you expected and the 2 versions are not resolving. Abdi looked back at him with an expression that was not quite recognition, and not quite its absence. Something in between, a delayed arrival, as if Samir's face was reaching him from a slightly greater distance than the doorway. Then Abdi smiled. The smile was real. Somewhere behind everything that had happened to his face, it was genuinely real. Samir moved in that afternoon. He moved in with a plan, which was more than anyone else had brought to the situation. He would manage Abdi's money. There was no money, which was a starting point of its own clarity. He would cut off the supply. He would find Yusuf's stall and explain that no more credit would be extended, that the debt would be addressed separately, that the supply was ending. He would get Abdi to the clinic whose name he found, on his second day in the house, written on a receipt in his father's handwriting in the pocket of Abdi's jacket, hanging on a nail by the door. His father had known the clinic's name for over a year. The receipt was in Abdi's jacket, not Hassan's pocket. At some point in some exchange Samir had not witnessed, Hassan had given his son the name of help, and not the help itself. Samir held the receipt in the doorway of the room for a long time. He called the clinic that afternoon. An intake assessment was scheduled for 10 days later. On day 3 of Samir's residence in the house, Abdi did not have Khat for the first time in over 2 years. Samir had intercepted the morning purchase, had been at the stall before dawn, had spoken to the vendor and to Yusuf, had made the position clear. The vendor had shrugged. Yusuf had looked at Samir with something that was not hostility, but was also not neutral. A flat considering assessment. The look of a man calculating a variable in a system he understood, and Samir did not. Day 1 without Kate. Abdi slept for 16 hours. His body ran down like a machine losing power, and he simply stopped. Day 2. He was awake but horizontal, the withdrawal symptoms moving through him. Not the dramatic physical crisis of opiate withdrawal, but something more psychological and more insidious, a flattening so complete that getting up from the mattress required more activation energy than his nervous system could generate. He lay and looked at the ceiling, and the ceiling was unremarkable, and the unremarkableness of it was unbearable. Day 3. He was upright. He ate something. He did not speak much. Day 4. Samir woke at 2 in the morning to find the room empty. Abdi was back by 5, carrying a bundle wrapped in banana leaf, moving quietly as if quiet would prevent the conclusion Samir had already drawn. He set the bundle on the windowsill next to the tin. He sat on the mattress. He did not look at his brother. Samir lay on his side of the room and looked at the ceiling. The clinic appointment was in 6 days. He would get Abdi there. He was certain of this the way young people are certain of things that experience has not yet tested. What Samir could not see, what nobody in that room could see, was the thing already in motion. In the weeks before his arrival, something in his brother's brain had passed a threshold that a few days of interrupted supply and a clinic appointment could not walk back. The sounds Abdi had been hearing were not stopping. They had expanded. Not louder, but more present, more insistent about their own reality. He was not telling Samir about them. He was managing them the way he'd been managing everything for 2 years. Privately, by incorporation, by folding the new impossible thing into the ongoing texture of daily life. The clinic appointment was on a Thursday. On Wednesday night, Abdi did not sleep. He sat on the mattress with his back against the wall, and the half-finished bundle on the windowsill, and the sounds moving around the edges of the room like something that knew the space better than he did. Samir slept 6 feet away, his breathing slow and even. In the morning he would take his brother to the clinic. In the morning the trucks from Ethiopia would arrive with the fresh supply. These 2 things would happen in the same morning, in the same city, as they had every morning and would every morning after, independent of each other, indifferent to each other, running on entirely separate tracks that had never been designed to intersect. The clinic appointment on Thursday morning lasted 40 minutes. A nurse took Abdi's blood pressure, elevated, and his weight, 51 kilograms, down from the 69 kilograms on his university enrollment form from 8 years earlier. A doctor asked questions from a printed intake form, writing the answers in a small, cramped hand. Abdi answered accurately on the factual questions: how long, how much, what kind, and inaccurately on the experiential ones: the sounds, the directional voices from below floors and across courtyards. He did not mention them, not because he was concealing them strategically, because in the presence of a doctor, in a bright room with a desk and a printed form, they did not feel like the kind of thing that had happened. The doctor recommended a structured reduction program, a tapering protocol, community support, weekly check-ins. He gave Samir a printed sheet with instructions and a phone number. He gave Abdi a referral letter to a counselling service that operated out of a mosque annex on the other side of the city. He noted on Abdi's file, Khat dependency, moderate to severe. He did not note the perceptual disturbances because Abdi had not reported them, and because the appointment was 40 minutes long and there were 9 people waiting outside. Samir folded the printed sheet and put it in his breast pocket. They walked home. Abdi was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Not the flat post-session silence, but something more interior, a person rearranging furniture in a room nobody else could enter. Samir walked beside him and did not fill the silence. He had learned, in the 4 days since arriving, that filling Abdi's silences produced responses that were grammatically correct and informationally empty. and that the empty responses cost Abdi something he could not spare. The tapering protocol lasted 11 days. On day 12, Abdi was buying from a vendor 2 neighbourhoods away from Youssef's stall, a vendor Samir did not know about, a transaction that happened before 6 in the morning while Samir was asleep. Samir found out at midday when he came back from a job interview at the logistics company and found Abdi on the mattress with the specific stillness of someone 3 hours into a session. He did not say what he found. He sat on his side of the room and looked at the logistics company's business card in his hand, and the print on it blurred slightly as his eyes lost focus. He did not leave. This is the fact that matters here. He did not leave. He adjusted his approach instead. He attended the Thursday counselling sessions with Abdi rather than dropping him at the door. He spoke to a community health worker in the neighbourhood, a woman named Anab who ran an informal support network for families of Khat users and who had been doing so for 6 years without salary, out of a room in her house 2 streets from the mosque, because the alternative was doing nothing, and she had found that intolerable. Anab gave Samir information nobody at the clinic had offered. Practical, granular, earned through repetition. She told him what the first 3 months looked like. She told him which part of the day was hardest. She told him to stop trying to eliminate the cat immediately and start trying to reduce the context. Fewer hours, fewer sessions, less isolation, more structure around the edges. Change the container before emptying it. Samir implemented this with the systematic focus of someone applying an economic framework to a human problem, which was both a limitation and, in the short term, a functional approach. June 2020, July. The reduction was real but uneven. Better weeks followed by collapsed ones. The graph of Abdi's consumption jagged rather than declining. He was chewing less than he had been in January. He was still chewing every day. The sounds had not returned at full intensity since Samir's arrival, which Abdi attributed to sleeping more regularly, and which may have been partially correct. But they had not stopped entirely. They had retreated to the periphery, a low directional murmur at the edge of a heavy session, a sound like someone in the next room saying something he couldn't quite catch. Samir started at the logistics company in August, a junior administrative role that paid enough to cover his share of the house costs and begin addressing the debt to Youssef. He went to Youssef directly, sat across from him at the stall in the early morning before customers arrived, and laid out what he could pay per month and what that would eventually clear. Youssef listened. He agreed to the arrangement without visible emotion, as if this too was a normal transaction in a system that had many normal transactions. He gave Samir a receipt, handwritten, unstamped, worth nothing in any legal context, acknowledging the balance and the payment schedule. Samir put the receipt in the same breast pocket as the clinic's printed sheet. He had been in Hargeisa for 4 months. He was managing his brother's addiction, paying down his brother's debt, starting a new job, and living in a shared house with a window that did not close fully. He was doing all of this on 4 hours of sleep because Abdi's nocturnal patterns, the late alertness, the irregular crashing, disrupted the room's circadian rhythm regardless of what Samir's body needed. In September, Samir bought a bundle of Khat. He bought it to stay awake during a night when Abdi was particularly agitated, moving around the room, unable to settle, the low murmuring sounds apparently present again though Samir couldn't hear them. He needed to be alert. He needed to monitor. The bundle was a practical decision, the same way Abdi's first bundle had been a practical decision, the same way all first bundles are practical decisions. He chewed. The alertness arrived. He stayed awake and monitored his brother through the night. The next day he was exhausted at work, and the day after that, and by the 3rd day the memory of the night's functional clarity was sufficient reason to buy again. He did not buy from Youssef. He used a different vendor entirely, a deliberate choice that required enough self-awareness to recognize as a choice and not enough to prevent it. By October, Samir was chewing 4 days a week. He told himself it was management. He told himself it was temporary. He used the same words Abdi had used in 2017, in the same sequence, with the same genuine belief attached to them, in the same city, 3 years later, as if the words were a script the city handed to everyone who arrived at that particular juncture. He had not told his parents. He had not told Anab. He attended the Thursday sessions with Abdi and sat in the circle and listened to other men describe the architecture of their dependency with a quality of recognition he was not ready to name. The October that Samir was chewing 4 days a week was also the October that Mahad Guled Ismail disappeared from the circuits where Abdi had known him. Not disappeared dramatically, not an event, not a crisis anyone responded to. Mahad simply stopped appearing at the sessions Abdi still occasionally attended, stopped being visible on the streets where he had been visible, stopped being mentioned in the conversations of men who had known him. Abdi asked about him once, to a man at the Mafresh near the bus terminal who had known Mahad longer than Abdi had. The man said Mahad had gone to his family in the Togdir region. He said it without particular weight, which was itself a weight. Abdi did not pursue it further. 2 weeks later, a mutual acquaintance told him the truth. Mahad had not gone to Togdir. Mahad had been admitted to a hospital in the Sheikh district, a facility primarily serving mental health cases, the only one in that region with more than 5 beds. He'd been found by neighbours in a state that the acquaintance described in clinical-sounding approximations that added up to what Layla's spreadsheet would have called acute Khat-induced psychosis. He was 33 years old. He'd been a mathematics teacher. Abdi sat with this information for a day. Then he went to Yusuf's stall. Samir did not know about the Mahad information when he came home that evening to find Abdi mid-session on the mattress. He knew something had shifted. The quality of Abdi's stillness was different, heavier, turned inward in a way that the usual post-purchase relief didn't produce. He sat on his side of the room. Neither of them communicated what they were actually doing, which was 2 men using the same drug in the same room for different stated reasons that were converging rapidly toward the same actual reason. November arrived. The clinic's tapering protocol had been abandoned for 2 months. The Thursday sessions continued, but Abdi's engagement with them had become performative. He attended, he sat, he did not speak unless directly addressed. The counsellor who ran the sessions, a retired teacher named Ibrahim who had his own history with Khat, and ran the group with the authority of someone who had been where these men were and had found a way out, noticed the shift in Abdi and addressed it directly in the 4th week of November. He asked Abdi, in front of the group, whether there was something happening that the group didn't know about. Abdi said there was not. Ibrahim looked at him for a long moment, the look of someone whose professional instrument is the detection of concealment, and then moved on. What Ibrahim could not know, because Abdi had never told anyone, was that the perceptual disturbances had returned at full intensity 3 weeks earlier and had not retreated. The sounds were continuous now, not always loud, not always directional, but present in the way that tinnitus is present, a new layer added to the acoustic environment that only he could hear. He had built a system of management around them. When they were loud, he talked over them, either to whoever was present or, if alone, to himself. When they were quiet, he ignored them. He had never named them, never called them voices, never framed them as anything other than a side effect of tiredness that would resolve when he was less tired. He was never less tired. The break happened in October 2021. It didn't happen during a heavy session. It didn't happen at the 30-hour mark of a continuous chew. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening when Abdi had consumed his usual amount, not more, not less, and had been sitting quietly in the shared house room while Samir was at work. The sounds, which had been continuous for months, suddenly organised themselves. They became specific. They became located. Beneath the floorboards of the room, the same location as the very first time, in the first extended session 18 months earlier, there were voices, not a tonal murmur anymore, voices, speaking. He could not make out words, but he could identify the speakers, his students, his former students from the school in Mohammed Haibe district, the ones who had sat in his classroom under the ceiling fan and read from the textbooks he had carried in a bag every morning. They were below the floor. They were calling to him. Something had happened to them and they were calling and he had to reach them. He went into the street at 2 a.m. He was found 40 minutes later by 2 men walking home from a late gathering, standing in the centre of the unpaved road 3 blocks from the house, his arms at his sides, speaking continuously to the ground beneath his feet, his voice steady and calm and entirely convinced of what it was saying. The men knew what they were seeing. They had seen it before, in other men, in this city, in this decade. They did not call an emergency service because there was no emergency service to call in any functional sense. They walked Abdi to the nearest clinic, not the one Samir had taken him to, but a smaller facility 4 streets away, the kind that operated with 2 nurses and 1 rotating doctor and a supply of basic pharmaceuticals that was reliable 3 weeks out of 4. The rotating doctor that night was a young man, recently graduated on his 3rd week at this particular facility. He assessed Abdi in a room with a single overhead bulb, working through a mental status examination he had learned in medical school 18 months earlier. He documented disorganized thinking, auditory hallucinations, paranoid ideation, agitation. He administered a sedative. He wrote on the intake form in the diagnosis field the words he'd been trained to write when this specific cluster of symptoms presented: acute psychosis, query schizophrenia. He had not been trained to ask about Khat as a primary causal factor. The medical school curriculum he had completed devoted 4 hours to substance-related disorders, of which 40 minutes covered Khat, framed as a social problem with mild stimulant effects rather than as a potential psychosis-inducing agent requiring specific diagnostic protocols. He was not incompetent. He was working with what he'd been given. Abdi was kept for 36 hours, sedated for most of them, and discharged when the acute agitation subsided. A family contact was listed on his form as Samir Warsam. Samir had been called in the middle of the night by the men who had found Abdi, and had arrived at the clinic 20 minutes later still in his work clothes from the evening shift, his eyes with a particular expression of someone whose worst imagined scenario has just been confirmed as insufficiently worst. The discharge papers listed the diagnosis: query schizophrenia, recommended follow-up with a psychiatric facility. A phone number was written at the bottom of the page. Samir drove his brother home in a borrowed car as the city woke around them. The morning trucks arriving from Ethiopia, the vendors setting up their carts, the first customers appearing at the stalls, the whole apparatus of the daily supply chain running its practiced route through the waking city. At home, he called his father. Hassan arrived within 20 minutes, moving faster than Samir had seen him move in years. He stood in the doorway of the room and looked at his son on the mattress, smaller than he had ever been, the sedative still in him, his breathing slow and even, his face composed in a way that the waking face had not been composed for a long time. Something happened to Hassan in that doorway that did not have a clinical name and didn't need one. He went home. He went to his shop. He went to the storeroom with the low wooden platform and the radio and the tin. He opened the tin. He looked at what was inside for a long moment, the dry dark stems, the last of his morning purchase. He closed the tin. He put it in a plastic bag. He carried the bag to the waste bin in the alley behind the shop and placed it inside without opening it again. He went back into the shop and sat at his counter and did not move for a long time. He had stopped. He did not know if he would stay stopped. He had tried before. But there was a difference this time, a specific, particular weight behind the decision that had not been present in the 2 previous attempts, the weight of what he had just seen in that doorway, which he suspected was something he would not be able to unsee regardless of what happened next. He did not tell anyone what he had done. He did not tell anyone what he'd been doing for 11 years. In his pocket, on a fresh receipt, was the name of the clinic he had been writing and rewriting for 2 years. This time, he called. The intake coordinator at the clinic was helpful and specific. She asked about the patient. Hassan said it was not for a patient, it was for himself. There was a pause on the line. Then she asked him to come in the following morning. He said he would. In Addis Ababa, Layla received an email that same week from the European funding body that had been supporting her research. The preliminary grant period was ending. The question of extension depended on what her data showed. She sent them the summary findings from her 53 cases, including, carefully framed, the Gid Kagar information, presented not as an accusation, but as a documented structural observation about the misalignment between prevention funding flows and implementation outcomes. The funding body responded in 10 days. The extension was approved. An additional €32,000 for a full 18-month research phase. She read the email. She did not celebrate. She opened her spreadsheet and looked at the column that said correct diagnosis on file, Y/N. The 31 cases marked N, and she started building the methodology for the next phase of the study. Somewhere in a clinic file in Hargeisa, a new entry had just been added to that column. It said N. It would say N for a long time. The second break happened in March 2022. Between October 2021 and March 2022, Abdi had been discharged, restabilized, and readmitted twice to facilities that were not equipped to treat what he actually had. Each admission began the same way, acute agitation, the voices fully organized and specific, the conviction about his students beneath the ground arriving with the force of absolute certainty, and ended the same way, with sedation, stabilization, and discharge into circumstances that had not changed. The room in the shared house, the window that did not close, Samir, who was now chewing daily and concealing it with the competence of someone who had watched his brother conceal the same thing for years and had learned, through observation, exactly how it was done. The second break was worse. Not in its presentation, the symptoms were recognizable, the same basic cluster, but in its aftermath. When the sedative cleared this time, Abdi did not return to baseline. The baseline had moved. The voices retreated but did not disappear. His thinking, which had been fragmented during the acute phase, did not fully reassemble on the other side. He sat in the ward bed at the larger hospital in central Hargeisa, a facility with 22 beds and 1 psychiatrist who visited twice a week, and answered questions slowly, with long pauses between words, as if each sentence was being constructed from components stored in separate locations. The psychiatrist who assessed him was competent and overextended. She had 18 patients to see in a 2-hour block. She reviewed the intake form from the October admission, which listed the diagnosis from the small clinic, query schizophrenia. The current presentation was consistent with that diagnosis. She prescribed risperidone, an antipsychotic effective for schizophrenia and for Khat-induced psychosis alike, in the acute phase, and noted in her assessment that the patient had a history of Khat use, listed as a contributing factor rather than a primary cause. The distinction between contributing factor and primary cause was not semantic. It determined the entire treatment architecture. A contributing factor meant the Khat was incidental background, the schizophrenia the target. A primary cause meant the opposite. Remove the cause, treat the neurological aftermath, monitor for resolution. 2 different conditions, 2 different prognoses, one file, one diagnosis, and the wrong one was already 3 months old and cross-referenced to the first admission, and therefore carrying the institutional weight of established history. Abdi was discharged after 9 days with a prescription for risperidone, a follow-up appointment in 6 weeks, and a file that now said schizophrenia without the query. The query had been dropped somewhere between the first admission and the second. Nobody had made a deliberate decision to drop it. It had simply fallen away through the rounding down that happens when provisional diagnoses meet administrative systems that prefer clean categories. He lost the prescription within 11 days, not carelessly. He put it in the drawer with a teaching certificate and the other accumulated papers of his life, and then the drawer was gone. The shared house owner, during a rent dispute with a different tenant, had cleared the room shared by Abdi and Samir while both of them were out, stacking their belongings in the courtyard in a direct echo of what Abdi's previous landlord had done 3 years earlier. When Samir came home to find the pile in the courtyard, he went through it methodically, salvaging what mattered. The drawer contents were loose in the cardboard box, the teaching certificate in its plastic sleeve, the calculation sheet from 2016, a phone charger, some papers. The prescription was not in the box. He searched the ground around the pile. He did not find it. The follow-up appointment 6 weeks later, Abdi did not go. He had no transport money, and no one reminded him, and the appointment existed on a paper that had been in the drawer that was now gone. The risperidone, while he had been taking it, had made a partial difference. Not a cure, not a restoration, but a reduction in the intensity of the auditory experience, a slight thickening of the membrane between his interior and the organised voices. Without it, the voices returned to their previous amplitude within 3 weeks of the last dose. He was not chewing anymore. This is important. Samir had, through a combination of physical proximity and resource control, effectively ended Abdi's access to Khat since the second hospitalisation. Abdi had not chewed since February 2022. The substance was gone. The voices remained. This was the clinical reality that the schizophrenia diagnosis obscured and that the correct diagnosis would have flagged. Khat-induced psychosis in its severe form, in a brain exposed to daily cathinone for 5 years, does not necessarily resolve when the cat stops. The dopaminergic sensitization, the process by which the brain's reward and perceptual systems have been altered by sustained stimulant exposure, can persist long after the drug clears. In a subset of patients, particularly those with prolonged heavy use and multiple acute psychotic episodes, the condition becomes functionally indistinguishable from primary psychosis. The brain has been changed, not temporarily disrupted. Whether Abdi was in that subset was a question that required a psychiatrist who knew to ask it, a patient history that accurately reflected the substance as causal rather than incidental, and a treatment protocol designed for the correct condition. He had none of these things. Samir knew his brother was not improving on the trajectory the hospital had described. He knew this empirically, day by day, watching the specific way Abdi moved through the hours, the long silences, the delayed responses, the moments of apparent complete absence where Abdi's eyes were open and his body present, and some essential operational part of him was somewhere else entirely. He called the hospital 3 times to explain that the improvement was not happening. The first call reached a clerk who took a message. The second reached a nurse who suggested waiting until the follow-up appointment, apparently unaware the appointment had been missed. The third reached the psychiatrist's assistant who confirmed there was no active file for Abdi at the facility, because the follow-up had not been attended and the file had been moved to inactive status. Inactive status. Samir wrote those 2 words in his phone's notes application. He looked at them for a while. He did not delete them. In April 2022, Mahad Guled Ismail died. He had been transferred from the Sheikh facility to his family's home in the Togdir region in late 2021, when the facility discharged him as stabilised, the same provisional stabilisation that had preceded Abdi's own discharges, the same conditional improvement that dissolved when the conditions changed. At home, without medication, without follow-up, in a household that loved him and had no tools for what he needed, he deteriorated over 4 months. The cause of death, listed on the death certificate issued by a district health office, was cardiac arrest. The underlying contributors, chronic malnutrition, cardiovascular stress consistent with years of stimulant use, the physical toll of a body that had not been adequately nourished in 5 years, were not listed as causes. They were the context in which the arrest occurred, invisible on the form, present in the body. He was 34 years old. He had been a mathematics teacher. Abdi was told by a man from the old Mafresh circuit who had heard from someone in Togdir. He was sitting in the courtyard of the new place, a room his parents were now paying for, in a building 2 streets from the family house in Sha'ab, close enough that Fadumo could bring food every day, which she did, arriving in the late morning with a covered plate and staying for 20 minutes, and then leaving because staying longer required her to watch her son's face for signs she did not know how to interpret. He received the news about Mahad and sat with it in the courtyard. The afternoon light moved across the concrete. A goat somewhere nearby made a sound and stopped. Abdi's hands rested on his knees, palms down, completely still. He did not cry. He did not speak. He stayed in the courtyard until the sun had moved past the building's edge and the shadow covered him, and then he went inside. He did not go to the vendor. There was no vendor to go to. Samir had mapped the stalls within walking distance and had spoken to each one. He did not go to Youssef. Samir had finished paying Youssef's debt in January, and the relationship had formally ended, which was itself a kind of geography, a road that no longer existed. Abdi simply sat with the news about Mahad the way he sat with most things now, without the processing architecture that would have allowed him to metabolize it, to integrate it, to place it in relation to everything else and draw a conclusion. The architecture was not available. It had been once. He could feel its absence the way you feel the absence of a word you once knew and cannot retrieve. Not a blank, but a shaped hole, the contour of something missing. Samir's own situation was deteriorating on a track that ran parallel to his brother's without touching it. He'd been chewing daily since November 2021. He was functional, still employed, still attending to Abdi's practical needs, still paying the rent and managing the logistics. But the chewing had restructured his days in the way it restructured everyone's days. The morning purchase, the afternoon session, the evening flatness, the late alertness, the insufficient sleep, the morning purchase again. He had been inside this loop for 5 months before he recognised it as a loop rather than a temporary operational adjustment. He recognised it on a Thursday evening when he found himself at the mosque annex where Ibrahim's support group still met, not to accompany Abdi, who had stopped attending, but because he had been walking past and the door was open and the sound of Ibrahim's voice through the open door said something that stopped him. He went in. He sat at the edge of the circle, in the position newcomers occupied near the door. Ibrahim looked at him once, the same considering look he had turned on Abdi months earlier, and continued without altering his pace. Samir came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. He did not stop chewing immediately. The group was not a mechanism for immediate cessation. It was something more structural than that, a place where the logic of the habit was named aloud in language that did not catastrophize it and did not minimize it, and where the naming, done consistently and collectively, began to create a distance between the person and the behaviour that had not existed before. Ibrahim called this distance the gap, not a dramatic rupture, just a sliver of space between the urge and the act, and in that sliver, the possibility of a different choice. Samir reduced, unevenly, with setbacks, with weeks that erased weeks of progress. But the direction, over the following months, was measurable. He told Anab, the community health worker, what had been happening. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she asked one question. Did Abdi know? Samir said he did not. Anab said that Abdi probably did know, in whatever part of him was still tracking the room. She said this without judgment, as a practical observation about how people who have shared a small space for long enough perceive each other, even when perception is impaired. Samir thought about this for a long time afterward. In Addis Ababa, Layla's 18-month research phase was producing data at a density she had not anticipated. She had established field contacts in Hargeisa, Dir Dawa, Djibouti City, and Mogadishu, community health workers, clinic administrators, the occasional sympathetic doctor, who were feeding her case data through a simple encrypted form she had designed specifically to be completable on a mobile phone with an unstable internet connection. The cases were accumulating. She had passed 80. She had passed 100. The misdiagnosis column, correct diagnosis on file, Y/N, was, at 107 cases, marked N for 62 of them, 58%. She'd been preparing to submit the full paper to a peer-reviewed journal when one of her Hargeisa contacts, the clinic administrator from the Shab neighborhood, who had started everything with the Gid Kagar information, sent her a message in November 2022. The message contained a name and a case number from the October 2021 admission at the small clinic near the bus terminal. The name was Abdi Farhan Warsame. The contact had encountered the case during a routine file review and had sent it because it fit Layla's profile precisely. Documented Khat dependency, acute psychosis, diagnosis listed as schizophrenia on the transfer record to the larger hospital. No subsequent correction in the file despite 2 further admissions. Layla opened a new entry in her spreadsheet. Case 109. She filled in the columns: name, age, reported first use, first hospitalization, diagnosis on file. When she reached the last column, correct diagnosis on file, she typed N. She did not know what Abdi looked like. She did not know about the room in the Shab neighborhood, or Fadumo's daily plates of food, or the plastic sleeve with the teaching certificate. She knew a case number and a diagnostic trail and a column that said N. She added a second tab to the spreadsheet, something she had not done before, and titled it Follow-up Required. She entered his case number as the first entry. Outside the clinic in Hargeisa, where his file sat in an inactive folder, the city moved through its evening, the generators starting up as the grid load shifted, the last Khat vendors packing up their unsold stems, the trucks from Ethiopia already loading for the next morning's delivery, the whole apparatus cycling through its daily rotation with the indifference of a machine that does not know or care what it produces, only that the production continues, that the leaves arrive cold and potent in the morning dark, that the first customers are already waiting before the stall opens, that the system runs because the system has always run and will run tomorrow and the day after, regardless of what is written in any column of any spreadsheet in any city. Samir had not chewed in 11 days. He was sitting in the courtyard in the evening, the same courtyard where Abdi had received the news about Mahad, watching the last of the daylight leave the top of the wall. His jaw was not working. His hands were still. He was tired in a way that was clean. The exhaustion of a body recalibrating, uncomfortable and honest. Nothing like the post-session flatness he'd been mistaking for rest. He did not know if day 12 would hold. He knew day 11 had. Layla's paper was published in the East African Journal of Psychiatry in March 2023. The title was precise and deliberately undramatic. Cat-related psychosis in the Horn of Africa, misdiagnosis patterns, onset compression, and structural gaps in treatment infrastructure across 109 documented cases. It was 11 pages. It had 4 tables and 2 graphs. The writing was the specific kind of dry that peer-reviewed medical literature requires, not because the findings were dry, but because the findings were incendiary enough that the dryness was armour. The core findings, stated in the paper's abstract without elaboration, 58% of documented cat-induced psychosis cases in the sample had been misdiagnosed as primary psychiatric disorders, predominantly schizophrenia. The mean age of first hospitalization had dropped from 34 years in 2014 to 26 years in 2022. The mean time from reported first use to first acute psychotic episode had compressed from 7 years to 26 months across the same period. In 11 cases, the compression was under 12 months. 11 cases. First use to psychotic break in under a year. She had written those 11 cases into the paper's appendix with enough anonymized detail that any clinician reading them would recognize the pattern immediately. Age, first use date, hospitalization date, diagnosis given, correct diagnosis, outcome at last contact. 4 of the 11 outcomes at last contact read, deceased. The paper received 140 downloads in its first month. By the standards of regional medical journals covering East African public health topics, this was a normal number. It was not a number that suggested the findings were about to alter policy, restructure diagnostic training, or redirect funding. It was a number that suggested the paper existed, was findable, and had been found by approximately the population of people who already knew to look for it. Layla presented at a global mental health conference in Nairobi in June 2023. She had 40 minutes. She used 38 of them on the data and 2 on the structural observation about prevention funding, the Gidkagar finding, now carefully documented and precisely framed, presented as a single case study illustrating a broader pattern of misaligned incentives in the regional response to cat dependency. The room held approximately 90 people. 12 were actively taking notes. The rest were listening with the polite, slightly unfocused attention of conference attendees who've been in session since 9 in the morning and are on their 4th coffee. A representative from an East African agricultural trade body gave the session's next presentation. He argued that Khat was a legally traded commodity, supporting millions of livelihoods across the region, that its cultural and economic role was inseparable from the communities where it grew and was consumed, and that framing it as a public health crisis required a proportionality of evidence that the existing research, he referenced Layla's paper by title, had not yet achieved at a population level. He was not wrong that the paper's sample size was limited. He was not wrong that 109 cases did not constitute population-level evidence. He was also not presenting data of his own. His presentation was 22 slides and contained no original research. There was polite applause after both presentations. Layla flew back to Addis that evening. She opened her laptop on the plane and looked at the follow-up required tab she had created 7 months earlier. Abdi's case number was still the first entry. Below it, 18 more had accumulated. Cases from her field contacts where the diagnostic record was incorrect and where, in her assessment, correcting it could still alter the treatment trajectory. Abdi's was first because it had arrived first, but also because his case, among all 109, had the most complete paper trail, the sequence of admissions, the diagnostic progression, the dropped query, the inactive file. It was a clean illustration of exactly how the system produced its outcomes, not through malice, through structure, through the accumulated small decisions of underfunded, overextended clinicians working inside systems that had never been built for this specific problem, applying diagnostic categories from a framework developed in populations where Khat did not exist, producing files that followed patients through subsequent admissions and calcified wrong answers into permanent record. She sent a detailed clinical summary, 7 pages, anonymized, specific, to the psychiatrist who made twice-weekly visits to the hospital where Abdi's active file now sat. She sent it through her Hargeisa contact with a cover note explaining the basis of her assessment and a request that the treating physician review the diagnostic history before the next scheduled appointment. She did not know if the psychiatrist would read it. She did not know if the appointment was still scheduled. She sent it because the alternative was not sending it, and she had already spent enough years observing what not sending things produced. The psychiatrist read it. She read it on a Wednesday evening, sitting in her car outside the hospital, because the ward was too loud to concentrate, and she had learned to do her reading in the car. She read Layla's summary once quickly, and then again slowly, cross-referencing against the file she'd pulled from the cabinet before leaving the ward. She sat for a while after the second reading. The following Tuesday, during her ward visit, she requested Abdi be brought for a full reassessment. Not the standard 50-minute medication review, but a 90-minute structured psychiatric evaluation, the kind the facility's resource constraints made rare and the clinical situation now required. Abdi sat across from her in a room with 2 chairs and a small table. He answered her questions. The evaluation covered not just his current presentation, but his complete history, from first use, through the escalation years, through each hospitalization, specifically probing the timeline of his perceptual disturbances relative to his consumption levels and his abstinence period. It was the first time anyone had asked these questions in this sequence, with this precision. After 90 minutes, she updated his diagnostic file. She changed the diagnosis from schizophrenia to Khat-induced psychotic disorder with persistent cognitive impairment. She noted that previous treatment had been partially appropriate. The risperidone was indicated for both conditions, but that the treatment goals, prognosis communicated to family, and recommended follow-up structure needed revision to reflect the correct diagnosis. She also wrote, in plain language at the bottom of the updated assessment, a single clinical observation that had no place in the official diagnostic coding but that she included because it was true and because someone needed to write it down. The cognitive impairment documented in this patient's current presentation was consistent with, and likely caused by, a combination of 5 years of heavy cathinone exposure and approximately 12 months of treatment for an incorrectly identified condition. The file now said the right thing. 2 years and 4 months after the first hospitalization. 2 years and 4 months of a wrong answer following Abdi through every system he had touched. Samir received a call from the hospital explaining the revised diagnosis and requesting a family meeting with the treating psychiatrist to discuss the updated prognosis. He took the afternoon off work. He was still at the logistics company, now in a senior administrative role, the 2-year tenure having produced the promotions that competence and reliability produce, and sat across from the psychiatrist in the same room with 2 chairs and a small table. She told him what the correct diagnosis meant. She told him what the treatment would now target. She also told him, with the directness of someone who considered false comfort a form of negligence, that the cognitive impairment documented in Abdi's assessment was likely permanent in significant part, not total, not without possibility of partial improvement with sustained correct treatment and structured support. But the executive function deficits, the working memory impairment, the processing speed reduction, these were not symptoms that would resolve on a treatment timeline. They were the shape of what remained. Samir sat with this. The room was quiet for a moment. He asked one question. What would the next 5 years look like if everything went right from this point forward? The psychiatrist answered honestly. Stability, managed symptoms, possible gradual improvement in some cognitive domains with occupational therapy and sustained medication adherence. Not a return to the classroom, not independent financial function in the near term, a life that was structured, supported and present, which was more than the trajectory had been pointing towards 6 months earlier, and less than what a 31-year-old man should have been facing. Samir thanked her. He walked out through the hospital's main corridor, past the admissions desk, through the heavy front door, into the afternoon light of Hargeisa. He stood on the pavement for a moment. He had been clean for 9 months. The Thursday group still met. Ibrahim still ran it. Samir still attended, now sitting in the middle of the circle rather than near the door. He called his father from the pavement. Hassan picked up on the second ring. He had been clean for 2 years and 3 months. He still went to the clinic, not weekly, not even monthly, but when the wait got specific, when the particular evening hour that had once belonged to the storeroom started pulling in a way that didn't feel manageable alone. The clinic's intake coordinator, the one who had received his call with a brief pause before asking him to come in, had become, across 2 years of occasional visits, something that did not have a formal title in their interaction, but functioned as a consistent anchor. He had never told her, or anyone at the clinic or anyone anywhere, what he'd been doing for 11 years before that first call. He had told one person, Fadumo. He had told her on a Sunday morning in their kitchen, sitting at the table where the family had eaten dinner every evening for 20 years, and what followed that conversation was a sustained renegotiation of what both of them understood about their marriage and their history that was still, 2 years later, in progress. Not broken, in progress. Those were different things. Fadumo still brought food to Abdi every day. She arrived at the same time, with the same covered plate, and stayed for 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes she talked about the shop, about the neighbourhood, about Samir, about small daily things, and Abdi listened, and sometimes responded, and sometimes did not respond, but was present in a way that was different from the absence of the worst years. The presence was limited and inconsistent, and it was real. The teaching certificate was still in its plastic sleeve in the drawer of the room his parents now paid for. Nobody had thrown it away. It was not a plan anymore, not a document pointing towards something. But it was there, flat and intact, the plastic protecting it from the humidity the way Abdi had intended when he first stored it that way, 8 years earlier, in a room where a 40-watt bulb buzzed and papers waited to be graded, and the future was a calculation he believed he could solve. In Addis, Layla submitted a second paper in late 2023, broader in scope, drawing on the now 131 cases in her database, co-authored with 2 researchers from the University of Nairobi and 1 from a London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine affiliate in Kampala. The co-authors gave it weight it had not had alone. The journal was higher ranked. The review process took 7 months. It was accepted in April 2024. In the section on structural barriers to correct diagnosis, the Gid Kagar case study appeared under a subsection titled Conflicts of Interest in Prevention Infrastructure. It was 2 paragraphs. Those 2 paragraphs were the most precise documentation of the Foundation's ownership structure and donor funding that had appeared in any published academic or journalistic source. The European donor body that had funded Gid Kagar was not named. The journal's legal reviewers had required that specificity be reduced. But the structure was described in enough detail that anyone familiar with the regional funding landscape would recognise it. Whether anyone who could act on that recognition would act on it, unknown. Whether the Gid Kagar Foundation was still operating and still receiving donor funding, yes, as of the paper's submission date. A 5th year of annual reports, written in the same vague language as the first 4, had been filed with the Somaliland Ministry of Finance, and forwarded to the donor body as evidence of continued operations. Layla received an email from the donor body's East Africa program officer 2 weeks after the paper's acceptance was announced online. The email was professional and brief. It noted that the published findings raised questions the body took seriously, and that an internal review of the Guide Kagar grant would be conducted. It thanked her for her research. She filed the email in a folder labelled, again without irony, later. She did not expect the internal review to produce a public outcome. She had been working in this region long enough to know the gap between an internal review being conducted and a structural change being implemented, a gap that was not measured in weeks or months but in the accumulated political weight required to move something that many interests preferred immobile. She was building that weight, paper by paper, case by case, contact by contact. It was slow. It was the only method available. The ward still had 12 beds. The waiting list was now 51 people. In Hargeisa, on a Thursday evening in November 2023, Samir walked out of Ibrahim's group into the night air. He had not chewed in 13 months. The city around him was its ordinary self. Generator hum, the smell of cooking from open doorways, a car moving slowly on the unpaved road, somewhere a child's voice, and then quiet. He stood outside the mosque annex for a moment. 13 months was not a guarantee of 14. Ibrahim had said this to the group plainly without softening it, that clean time was not a wall that protected you from what was behind it, but a distance you were actively maintaining, and that the maintenance was daily, and that knowing this was not discouraging but accurate, and accurate was more useful than comforting. Samir had written this down on his phone. He looked at it sometimes. He walked home through the streets of Shab in the dark, past the hardware shop with a blue sign that was closed for the evening, past the house where he had grown up, past the corner where the Khat vendor had set up his cart for 20 years, and where a younger man had taken over the cart 2 years ago, when the original vendor relocated to a different district. The new vendor was 17. He had been selling Khat since he was 15. He did not know Abdi Warsam's name. He did not know what the green stain on a wall 2 streets away looked like. He knew the price of Highland Leaf versus Lowland, the difference in potency, the names of his regular customers, and the time the morning truck arrived. He would be at the cart before the truck came. He was always there before the truck came. What would happen to him in 5 years was a question that this city, this system, this supply chain running on its ancient indifferent schedule had never been designed to ask.